Thank you, everybody, for attending tonight's talk about Louisa Greef, who incidentally appears on my family tree, but sadly not on a direct line to me, or I might have inherited a bit of her business acumen. We are so sorry to have to change our plans tonight, but as we have just learnt that COVID can infect a whole group of people in one go, and we wanted to keep you all safe, as well as the fact that some of us are still a bit below par. If you, oops, can't read my own writing there. I think it affected my eyesight. If you enjoyed tonight's talk, you might like to send a little donation via our website. We are really grateful to Anne for agreeing to deliver her talk over Zoom. Dr. Anne Kennedy Smith is a writer and critic with reviews and essays in the TLS, History Today, and Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, among others. She gained her master's in creative writing at UEA in 2015, and since then has been researching and writing a blog about the Cambridge Ladies' Dining Society from 1890 to 1914. She has worked as a volunteer at the David Parr House and is a fellow commoner of Clare Hall, Cambridge. If you haven't already, please will you mute yourselves now and ask any questions through the chat box. We will endeavour to leave enough time at the end to answer them all. Thank you. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you, Mary, for that lovely introduction. I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay, but just put your hand up or something if there's anything urgent you need dealt with. So the format tonight, you're probably familiar with it. I'm going to talk for about up to 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So do, as things occur to you, put them in the chat box, and we'll have a chat later. And I think that bit's not recorded, as far as I know. So thank you for coming. I'm glad you didn't have to venture far from into the rain. I'd like to thank Nikki Morland and the Mill Road History Society for inviting me, and Mary Naylor for taking me around Mill Road Cemetery at one point to see the Louisa Greef grave, the family plot, and also to my friend and colleague Shelley Lockwood for her inspiring work at David Parr House, and she was the person who got me into the this particular niche section of women in business in Cambridge. And it's a very small introduction on my part, but I enjoyed the research, and I know some of you were lucky enough to attend Shelley's talk last month, which I know you will have enjoyed. So no comparisons, please. I'm also grateful to my friend Lizzie Broadbent, who writes a blog called online called Women Who Meant Business, and it's a project celebrating pioneering businesswomen in the UK. And she's been very helpful in providing information about the Garrett sisters' house decorating business, and any remaining mistakes are my own. So this evening's talk is about the enterprising Louisa Greef and other women who ran businesses in Victorian Cambridge or had working connections there. And I'll mention Florence Keynes and a few others of the more sort of the middle class university attached women that I'm particularly looking into. To start with, I'm just going to say about a general look at this history. The history of more middle-class women attached to the university has been fairly well documented, but it's hard to find data on the number of women who oversaw traditionally male businesses at the time. In her book, Women and Business since 1500, Beatrice Craig writes that British historians have made extensive use of city and state trade directories, censuses, and the records of insurance companies to try to track down women in business. All sources hide a number of women in business. Married women's business, in particular, businesses, are often attributed to their husbands or simply invisible, and the inheritance thing is something we're going to cover here. Okay, so could we have our First slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so here you see a memoir, the cover of a memoir by Florence Ada Keynes, and the design, of course, was by her niece, Gwen Ravera. Niece, was she? Anyway, I just forgot what the connection is, but anyway, a family connection. And she called her book Gathering Up the Threads, and that's a picture of the tram there. So, as I said, it's sometimes hard to find in the records women in business. So sometimes personal accounts give us a clue, give us a way in. In her memoir written in 1950, Florence Ada Keynes paints a memorable picture of how, having been one of the first students at Newnham College, Cambridge, in the 1870s, she married John Neville Keynes and settled in the town. And here's what she said. In 1882, I joined the ranks of residents in the town. It was a moment when university society was transformed suddenly by the new statutes which gave general permission to fellows of colleges to retain their fellowships after marriage. And this is one of the dates in Cambridge University's history that's not often talked about in the official histories, but had great significance for town and gown and women in higher education, of course. 1881, women students at Cambridge were given the right to sit for final year exams. Before that, it had just been by individual permission. And in 1882, all academic dons, not just professors and masters, were permitted to marry. And I discovered part of the reason for this was the colleges had, by Elizabethan charter, been prevented from building on their land, but a new parliamentary act in 1860 allowed the colleges to build, and so they could get tax and profits from houses. So coincidentally, they allowed their fellows to marry. So it's the latter date, 1882, that's particularly significant for this talk. And if we just go ahead to slide 4, Nikki, please. We're going to come back to this one, but just the 4th one. Yep, that's it. So I've done this before. This is just a sort of snapshots of Victorian brides, because it was said in 1882 that 30 weddings took place in that first summer alone. And people joked about an army of brides taking over the town. And this always gives me visions of Victorian brides in white lace dashing along the cobbles and climbing over college walls. But in fact, the change towards fellows being permitted to marry was a more gradual process, something that some of the colleges, especially Trinity, had been working towards for some time. So the historian Christopher Brooke has described the first generation of wives and female students during this time as pioneers and settlers of a new territory. Many of these new wives were highly educated, some of them former students of Newnham and Girton, who held forward-thinking beliefs about the role of women, different roles women could have. Florence Ada Brown completed her studies at Newnham, as I said, and married the economist and Pembroke College fellow John Neville Keynes in 1882. And as we know, she later became city councillor, town magistrate, and city mayor. But long before that, she was also involved in voluntary organisations to improve conditions for less privileged people in the town. So there were various reasons why Oxford and Cambridge decided to allow their teaching fellows to marry. University reforms, the establishing of new universities in London, Manchester and Bristol, the changing curricula, and competing for the best students. But as I said, some may have been financial. And it's Jeremy Lander's dissertation available on the Capturing Cambridge website, who's got more information about this. So these legal changes had a major effect on the physical landscape of Cambridge itself. Substantial family-sized houses began to be built in areas such as Grange Road, Madingley Road and Brooklands Avenue, among others, for the new university families. And Caius College developed St Paul's Road and Harvey Road near St Paul's Church. They developed an estate of 16 substantial family houses that were designed by local architect John Morley to be uniform in appearance, and they cost £2,400 for a pair. And this is the bit that becomes relevant to our talk. Most of the houses were finished in 1883, some earlier. The Keynes family moved into number 6 Harvey Road as Florence Keynes writes, driving the workmen out of the house. And she describes how the paint was still wet when they moved in. And so we'll be coming on to this aspect of interior decorating. So could we go back to slide number 2, please, Nikki, with her memoir. So she describes in this book how Harvey Road was ideal for families, a stone's throw away from verdant farmland and a short walk to the railway station. And the family stayed there for all of her life. Other distinguished residents of the road included the composer and Trinity Professor of Music, Charles Villiers Stanbrook, and his family, and the Bateson family. Florence Keynes writes, "It was a friendly community. We shared a ground with tennis courts. We subscribed to plant trees in the road. We started a book club, which ran for about 12 years. So all sounds very familiar. But as I mentioned, she was involved in issues affecting the town. Oh yes, there was that quote that she said it was a small, fresh society where we all knew one another. So that's very much how the women worked together, really, because they had this sort of special, it was like the beginning of a new society there in Cambridge. So if we just look at the first slide again, Nikki, please, with her awareness of the town. It's just a passing reference in this particular memoir, but she recalls being amused as a young married woman by the names of Greef, Sad, S-A-D-D, and Pain, P-A-I-N, apparently, over the shops in King's Parade in Cambridge. So, and this is a watercolor by Louise Rayner from around that time. So these were all long-standing family businesses. So I think could you please go through to slide 5, the 5th slide, Nikki? Okay, so just before I come on to just the one before that, I think, the Greef family, which we're going to come back to, just want to say a couple of words about the other sort of houses that were being decorated at this time. So there was a lot of interest following William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. And the newly married women, the wives of the Dons, wanted houses that were sanitary and modern in their drainage, heating and lighting. And earlier I mentioned my research for the David Parr house, and we know that obviously David Parr was employed by Frederick Leach, who Shelley talked about last month, and he was one of the people who benefited from the new opportunities of domestic decoration in Harvey Road and elsewhere. And one of the houses that he eventually decorated was the house that the artist Gwen Ravera grew up in, which is now, of course, part of Darwin College. And her words echo really what Florence Keynes says, "I belong to the first hatching of fellows' children and was born into a society which was still small and exclusive. The town, of course, didn't count at all." So she's being very tongue-in-cheek writing about this 60 or 70 years later, that their sort of separation, the university separation from the town. But I think there was a bit more mixing than among the women than perhaps she's giving credit for there. So if we go to the next slide, please. Yes, so Maud, Gwen Ravera's mother, Maud, had her father, George, who is a portrait. So there's Maud obviously on the left and George in his study in Newnham Grange in the middle, painted by the young Gwen Ravera. And there she has done a drawing of the house, the Newnham Grange house. And she said that we have a letter from Maud saying that when they first moved into this house, when they were about to move in, Maud, tried to get Frederick Leach to come and decorate for them, sort of oversee the decorating, but he couldn't. And my understanding of this, he was probably too busy at the time. He was doing a lot of church decorating and going around the country, as well as his domestic business, which was just getting started. But later on, he did do work in the house for the George Darwin and family and for other Darwins in Cambridge at the time. And I think that shows how it was sort of word of mouth. If one person recommended a good skilled workman, it went round. So this is going to be relevant when we come on to the next person. So just one more slide, please, the next one. Yeah, so that was Maud Darwin described Frederick Leach as a man with a great deal of taste. So she was very keen to do things. She was an American coming to Cambridge, and she wanted to do things the right way and have who other people recommended as a good craftsman. And we see here on the right his business card at the time. And it's a business card saying Leach and Simpson, 3 St Mary's Passage, Cambridge. Art, colours for amateur paintings and pottery, serges, velvets, crotons, and various other things. So it was that was Leach's showroom. He also had his offices on King's Parade, but this was the showroom for his new branching into domestic commissions. So just as an aside, we don't have that much information about her, but we know the Simpson in this. This is the only official reference to Isabella Simpson, his sister, who ran the showroom. Next slide, please. And so she was a businesswoman in her own right and a seamstress, not on the scale of Frederick Leach, but she owned her own draper's shop near Waltham Abbey. Sadly, she was widowed, and because Frederick Leach was starting this new sort of aspect of his business, and that's a picture of the showroom on the right there, which is now the Sahara, I think, clothes shop. It's a clothes shop anyway. And there's still his mantelpiece upstairs and evidence of the arts and crafts style there. So, yes, so Isabella was a seamstress and needlewoman who'd run her own draper's shop for many years. And Frederick had helped her set up this first business, building display stands and wooden racks. So after her husband died, it must have seemed the perfect arrangement, combining family and business, when she agreed to return to Cambridge, where she grew up with Frederick, and work with him running this beautiful shop and showroom and living with her grown-up children in the flat above the shop. And so we're going to come back to Isabella in a minute. So that's an introduction to her. So as I said, it was a good time for domestic interiors in the 80s. And Leach also continued his work for the colleges. And this is where the Louisa Greef comes in, because I was looking through Newnham College's account books from the 1880s, looking for reference to Frederick Leach's work there, when the name Greef caught my eye. There was a carefully written note of a payment at Newnham College to L.Greef, painter, and I assumed this referred to a man. After a chat with Shelley, I did some further research into Greef's college account books held at Cambridge University Library. And if we go back to slide 3, I think it is. Sorry, they're a little bit out of order there. So I discovered all these huge, very old account books, which all the colleges, which the university library had acquired from each individual college. Each of these books pertains to a different college, and they have been kept up from the 1780s, I think, up until the 1860s and 70s, and after, when Louisa came in. So some of these college account books date from the 1790s. I discovered that Louisa Greef was in fact a woman who took charge of the long-established family business and successfully took it in a new direction. So who was she? I'm afraid I don't have a photograph of her, but if anybody can come up with one, I'd be very grateful on Ancestry. But we know where the grave, as I said, the family plot is in Mill Road Cemetery. So she was born Louisa Heady in Cambridge in 1829, the fourth and youngest child of William Heady, a butler at Clare Hall, as Clare College used to be known, and Elizabeth Heady. Louisa grew up in the Radegund buildings, Jesus Lane. Later, the family moved to Ray's Court off Sydney Street, and before her marriage, Louisa worked as a governess. She married Robert Greef in 1863 and moved into his family home at 4 King's Parade. Robert Greef was by then in charge of his family's long-established plumbing and glazing business. He'd taken over running the business from his mother, Anne, who'd been in charge since becoming a widow in 1838. So this is what we talked about at the start, that most women in business that we know about inherit their husbands died, and they took it over, often running it until a male relative could step in. And this is what happened in this case. So he took it over 1863. and they married, anyway, they married in 1863. And in 1864, they had a baby, Louisa Ellen, but sadly she died, and that she was buried in the family plot. So in the 1871 census, Robert Greef is listed as a plumber master employing 10 men. In 1876, Robert died, aged just 43, like his father, died quite young. And Louisa, aged 47, took over running the firm with the help of two of her nephews who were employed as apprentice accountants. As I said, it was not unusual for a widow to take charge of a family business in this way. And her mother-in-law had been in charge while bringing up her 3 children. So the Greef business had been supplying the colleges since the 18th century. And the evidence we have shows that after 1876, when Louisa took over, she was evidently keen not just to manage it, but to take it in new directions. According to the 1881 census, so just 5 years later, she was employing 30 men, meaning that in 5 years since she was in charge, the company's size had tripled. And to give an idea of perspective on this, her company was roughly the same as Frederick Leach's company at that time. So because of the David Powerhouse, we know, and his diaries, we know a lot about Frederick Leach, but we don't know very much about Louisa Greef. But it's obvious that she was able to expand her company because she made a decision to expand into the area of painting and decorating to cater for the growing demands of colleges and domestic customers, shops too, of course. And Louisa was obviously ambitious. In 1882, her company was one of 3 to tender a quotation to refurbish the Cambridge Guildhall. And if we go forward to slide, I think it's slide 9, but it'll probably be obvious, the Guildhall there. And we see a drawing, watercolor drawing from the time of the Guildhall as it was, presumably before decorating, I'm not sure. And then beneath it, we have Frederick Leach's estimate from June 1882. And if we go to the next slide, please, we can see Louisa's estimate. So these are photographs from some of the big account books that are held in the Cambridge University Library. And her account is 600, her quotation is £600. And I think Frederick Leach's was slightly more than that. But perhaps because of he was a very well-known name and trusted outside Cambridge, he got the job. But yes, and the other person tendering against him was the firm of Trotter and Malcolm, based in Bryanston Square in London. So yes, Frederick got the contract based on an estimate of £629, and the building was replaced by the current Guildhall in 1939. However, there was plenty of work to go round for both of these painting and decorating firms. If we go to the next slide, please. Okay. And I can't quite see it on this, but on the right, on the left here, there's a photograph of Leach's diary from the time, and somewhere in that, there's a reference to Greef. So that this is Leach's diaries, but there's a reference to working with Louisa Greef's men, we assume, in decorating Trinity Hall. And one of the difficulties of sort of finding images of interior decoration of the time is because they change and people don't always keep them the same. But this is just a photograph from Swan House in Chelsea, and that shows some work that the Leach business and David Parr specifically worked on during this time. So it was a mix of the college work and more practical things like plumbing and building work, and then the more artistic side of decorating, which they undertook. So around this time, I discovered that that L.Greef company had been employed at Newnham College. I discovered that, yes, it was Michaelmas term 1885 that Louisa Greef took over the painting and decorating work that had previously been carried out by F.R. Leach, because my assumption was that Frederick Leach was the person who did everything and others just picked up the work he didn't want. But this was a case of Newnham College actually preferring changing from their contract with Frederick Leach, changing it to Louisa Greef. So it might have been that Leach's success meant that the company had become too expensive for Newnham, or too unavailable, who had to manage their finances very carefully in their early years. The vice principal and mathematician, Eleanor Sidgwick, one of the women in the Ladies' Dining Society that I research into, she was in charge of the accounts, and she called it chasing tuppences. And when I was in the archive turning over the page of the Newnham College account books, I was thinking about how hard the small team of women, at this point it was just run by Eleanor Sidgwick, Anne Clough and Helen Gladstone, how hard they were working to keep the college going and make it available to more women, more new generations of students during those years. They had to do a lot of fundraising as well. Did they also want to support a decorating company that was run by a professional, independent woman who also happened to offer them the best price for the job? It's possible. So if we have time, we'll come back to Newnham later. So I don't have an image for this one, but I just wanted to a little aside, because it's interesting when you do research, you always come up with, people talk about rabbit holes, but you find some other things that you weren't actually looking for. So when I was looking through the Greef account books in the university library, I came across something I wasn't expecting, an estimate book from the colleges for another woman's painting and decorating business that was operating during the same period. And this was based at 3 All Saints Passage. And I discovered that after her husband's death in 1886 or 1887, Mrs. Pratt took charge of F. Pratt and Son, her husband's painting and decorating business. At first, estimates were signed by managers for Mrs. F. Pratt, but soon, as she defined herself more as a businesswoman, she confidently signed estimates and bills with the more straightforward Mrs. Pratt, painter, etc. And she would remain the boss for the next 10 years. During these 10 years, Mrs. Pratt's business was kept very busy painting and decorating a wide range of shops, private houses, bridges, and even a greenhouse in Cambridge and further afield. They must have been competing with Louisa Greef's decorating business for college work. There were estimates given to the same colleges that Louisa worked for, including St. John's, King's, Keys, and St. Catherine's. We don't know which was the most successful company in terms of income, but the Pratt decorators were certainly much in demand, travelling as far as London in 1885 to prepare 7 paper beams in sitting room with oak paper at Mr. Wyman's town residence in Russell Square. They also completely redecorated Cockfield Rectory in Suffolk. The bill came to £55, 17 shillings, a considerable sum at that time. So, as I said, with the growing number of university families settling in the town, there was plenty of work for both companies to do. In July 1888, Mrs. Pratt gave an estimate to Mr. Edwin Wallace, an estate agent on East Road, for painting 2 of his houses and shops at 38 and 40 Regent Street. The traditional main employers had been the colleges, which it seemed that Louisa Greef was still mainly catering for. But the enterprising Mrs. Pratt was picking up business from the new private domestic customers, university wives and their families in the leafy suburbs, as well as the shops in the town that catered for their needs. And in 1897, Mrs. Pratt's son, Frederick, took charge of the family business. And after that, the trail runs out. I'm not sure what happened to her. But she'd obviously left it in a good state for him to carry on. So I mentioned Isabella Simpson previously. Are you able to go back to that slide, Nikki? The 3 St. Mary's Passage. Yes, thank you. So what happened to Isabella Simpson running this shop? Well, it's a little bit of a mystery, but I'm grateful to Shelley because she found out some things about how her business went. And sadly, things didn't go according to plan. There seems to have been a disagreement between Isabella and her successful brother, Frederick Leach, increasingly successful. And Shelley found an undated letter from Isabella to Fred, in which she appears to be ending their business arrangement. And I'll just quote from it here. I may as well tell you now, I'm writing that in all probability or we rather, she and her children, shall be leaving Cambridge, so I think when the present orders of needlework are completed, you may as well arrange with someone else, and then it will not cause any confusion, as my movements will be very uncertain for some time hence. I trust the word obligation applies to both you and I, and if I have failed in not turning business to as good an account as was hoped, I ask you to forget I was ever amongst it, but I did my best for your interests conscientiously. Therefore, I think that that is all for the present, except that I shall see you before my exodus. So it's a little bit of a sad ending, for the brother and sister who had been very close. But I'm sort of reading between the lines that Frederick, maybe she wasn't making enough money, maybe she wasn't doing running the business the way he wanted her to. So you can sort of see the hurt that's coming through her words. But I think it's interesting, and I'm speculating slightly, but she had run her own shop quite successfully before, but it was only when she started working with Frederick that it all went wrong. So maybe he just was she wasn't able to do things the way she wanted to do them. But I wanted to, before I finish with Louisa Greef, end on a slightly happier note. Florence Keynes notes the names Grief, Sad and Pain were over the shops in King's Parade, but it's not a sad story for Louisa. By 1891, she'd handed over the management of the business to her nephew Henry Heady, and continued to live at King's Parade. Her other nephew, Arthur Heady, the accountant, had married and moved away to Kent. So it was left to Henry to continue the plumbing and decorating business which she had so successfully built up. And the extent of his commitment can be seen in the fact that he decided to change his name to Henry Edward Greef. When the Museum of Cambridge opened in 1933, Henry donated a beer jug inscribed with the name Thomas Greef to commemorate the long-running business which he ran until his death in 1942. And Louisa Greef had a long and it seems happy retirement, living with her two unmarried nieces, Annie and Alice Fuller. She died in 1913. So as a sort of an addendum to just a concluding section to this, slightly different, but I would like to go to the next slide, which we haven't seen, the Garrett sisters. Oh, yes. Oh, could we just go back one, please, to it's a little bit out of sync, but this was just a contemporary drawing of Newnham, the exterior of Newnham College at the time, with the Queen Anne buildings designed by Basil Champneys. And this is going to be relevant to the last section, which I'll just briefly talk about, another all-women decorating firm from the time with Cambridge connections. So if we could go to the next slide, Nikki, please. And this is about the cousin and the cousins Rhoda Garrett and Agnes Garrett, who've started their own business. So one of the, if any women's interior design businesses are well known from this period, one of the first was established by Agnes Garrett, who's the one on the right here, the white dress, working with her younger cousin Rhoda Garrett. And the cousins initially hoped to train as architects, but this was such an unknown quantity. They didn't succeed, but they were taken on by the architect J.M. Bryden as apprentices in 1871. And their business included designing furniture and wallpapers aimed at middle-class customers with modest incomes. And they also ran a school of interior design. And they were both very active suffragists, joined the National Society for Women's Suffrage in 1871. So it's interesting because they are now considered to be the first women house decorators, the first British business to be registered and run by women. Agnes, who you see on the right, was the younger sister to Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, pioneering medical doctor, and 2 years older than Millicent Garrett Fawcett, suffragist leader and co-founder of Newnham College. And while Agnes had a stable upbringing in a relatively wealthy family with a good education, Rhoda's family situation was more different. Her father was a clergyman with low pay and a large family, and Rhoda was required to earn her own living. So I think this sort of takes us into an interesting area, because at the time, I'm sure you know, middle-class women virtually the only thing they were kind of allowed to do by their families was to become a governess. But women were starting to get interested in the professions, and one of the ways into that was, I mentioned at the start, Florence Kane's starting up, belonging to a ladies' discussion society, which is bigger than the little group I talk about. But they had lots of talks by different people coming to talk about different professions for women being possible. So these two did blaze a trail. And the researcher Miranda Garrett, who must be a descendant, I'm imagining, suggests that there were at least another 18 female-led interior decoration companies operating in Britain between then and 1899. And when I was in the university library recently, I looked at their book, because they published a book in 1874 in a series about interior decorating. And if I could bring up the quote from it here, I may not be able to see it, but basically they were trying to move away from the sort of rather stuffy, fussy Victorian things with all the fancy things in the houses. And now, where will I find that? Is it here? Oh, I'll come to. I might come back to that in a minute. Yeah, so they wanted houses to be much more simply designed and have more simple furniture. And in this image on the right here, we could see, not a very particularly revealing image, but it was just that it was much simpler furniture designed in a way that didn't hide how it was made, and it didn't have all these curlicues and swirls and things like that. And they said, even if you have wallpaper in a room designed, always make sure you have at least one wall that is plain, so the eyes have somewhere restful to contemplate. And there, I think it might have been a relative, but the composer Hubert Parry stayed in one of their houses and said, "This is the most peaceful house I've ever stayed in." And then he contracted them to do some interior design for his house. So if we go to the next picture, please. And it gets, sadly, Rhoda, the younger one, was always had the long-term health issues, so she died quite young. But Agnes kept up her work, and she ran the company till 1905, I think. So another instance of and I've now just remembered what the Cambridge connection is, because there was this connection to Newnham College. There's always been, and when I was in Newnham College recently, some of the archivists were saying, well, we're not sure if Agnes Garrett and Rhoda did any work here, but it seems sort of likely that they did, because the family connection, and because one of Champney's buildings was being built in 1874, but also there is proof that they decorated the sitting room of their niece, Philippa Fawcett, and she was the student who became a star in mathematics, got a brilliant grade in mathematics and shocked all the men. And she became a teaching fellow at Newnham, and they decorated her. So there is archival evidence to show that they decorated her little sitting room. So it just seems logical they probably did other things in Newnham as well at this time. So I just think it's a nice connection, once again, to the Women's College employing a woman. So I think there's just 2 more slides, and then that's it. So this is just a wintry picture of Mill Road Cemetery, from Mill Road Cemetery website, where I got some information about the Greef family, and I think that's it. So there's just one more slide. And if you would, thank you very much for coming. And if you would like any more information about what I've covered very fleetingly today, do get in touch via my website and newsletter. And I'll probably I'll write a bit more about this after tonight. So just remains for me to say thank you very much for coming. And if there's any questions, I hope you will ask them. Thank you. Thank you, Nikki and Mary and Carol. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was very interesting. And I'm also been listening live. My screen's very small, so I have to bring it closer to my face. But you actually did send me the slides, so I'm going to go back and have a look at them.
Oh, right.
one day I'm going to get into the university library and see some of these books.
Oh, yes.
It's a place I have never yet got a ticket for. I think I probably should.
Yeah, it's not that difficult. So just give them a good excuse. Good.
I think because of my connections with the Cambridgeshire Family History Society, I can do that now. I
Yeah.
just need to get up and go to do it. And
Yeah.
have got to hear from Caro. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from the floor? There's nothing in the bottom.
Anne, can I ask Nikki? Can I ask? Do you think it was? I mean, there was that link that because the big houses were being built and the fellows were marrying, but there is this particular sort of interior design, decorating. Have you found any other businesses wider than that in your researches yet?
Not really. I mean, because I was particularly looking for Leach connections at the time, that was what so it was a very specific time and area that I was looking at. But I know from that the PhD that the person did on the Garrett's decorating business, and she said there were 18 others, and that was presumably in the UK. So I don't know who else was operating in Cambridge. Is that what you mean, sort of? Or
yes, perhaps it was at Cambridge. It'd be interesting to know how much it was.
Yes, yes. And Mary Naylor kindly sent me some information about Mary Quincy, and that she inherited her husband's building business. And I think it did come with some debts, but I think she managed to run it fairly successful as well. And you said, Mary, that there's a lot of female landladies.
Yeah.
So pub landladies from this time as well. And Louisa Greef's sister, maybe sister-in-law, was running a bakery on Sydney Street as well. Once again, inherited from the husband. But I think it's interesting to see how women took it perhaps in different directions. And once they were put in charge, they had their own ideas, how, less traditional, perhaps, adapting to the time.
Yes, and I think Claire Martison's favourite occupation is the lodging housekeeper. Because of course it is something that you could do as a woman, because you could be at home. And if you were a widow, it was something that would keep the home in your family.
And all those laundresses as well.
Yeah.
There are plenty of working women, but it's the idea of having employees and being in charge, which is great to see.
Yes, yes. So the laundresses, Maggie, were they the college laundresses mostly, or taking
the town? From what I've heard of the life around Mill Road and Townsend's talk last year, the town was full of laundresses, but largely for the colleges. But if they were small scale, that would have been a lot of women running their own business. But so different from this, being in charge of a firm with lots of employees. And perhaps decorating lends itself well to being led by a woman, because with the expansion of families with money, the clients are more interested in the decor, and perhaps that led to more scope for sort of, encouraging discussions with the client about what you might do, perhaps. I don't know.
Yes, and the fact that these were sort of quite contemporary ideas. And
yeah,
it's interesting that that's the book that I mentioned that the Garrett sisters wrote. That was in a new series. They had quite prestigious people writing these books, and they were the second or third one to write a book for it. So their opinions mattered, and that they had, questions of taste and things. So it's just interesting that it was. I hadn't really come across that women could be considered to be judges, that men were sort of trusting their judgment, and they're quite forthright in their judgments. They're not, and they say that instead of the wife being brought in to sort of add fancy things at the end, that the women should be involved from the beginning and just making more important decisions about how the whole thing will look, not just to try to impress people by rich materials and this sort of thing. That actual design structure was more important. And they also felt that interior design was part of architecture. So that's an interest. It wasn't just a sort of an add-on. They felt you had to be trained in architecture to be able to design, you know, the interior of a house as well as the exterior.
We have one question about the paint. I mean, you can open this out to the floor as well. Does anybody know where they got their paint from? What sort of paint they use? I should
That's
imagine.
yeah. I'm afraid I don't know. I would love to know. That's a very good question. I will look into that.
We know that there were colourist shops in Cambridge which dealt in that, you know, but I can't go much further than that. David Parr does mention quite a lot of the types of paint that he uses, like lead white, popular one, but apart from that, I don't know. I suppose they would have bought paint, but I should imagine there was a lot of mixing of perhaps tones and things for decoration itself.
Yes, and you probably, it's, you know, as I say, the difference in decorating cottages, because one of the things that, I don't know, it always slightly surprised me, it's not really the college employing them, it's people within the college employ them. So they would be doing work for individual professors and things like that. So presumably it was kind of price-based and things, how they worked out what materials they would use, and perhaps more than the sense of individual beauty and style in their rooms, I'm guessing.
So the research project to take it on.
There's another comment Caro's put in there, that somebody once told me that there are quite a few women undertakers, again inheriting from their husbands, but Caro said she hadn't actually looked at that. But obviously the women didn't appear at the actual funerals, but that's an interesting thought as to whether there were women undertakers after their taking over their husbands' businesses.
Yes, yes.